What if a simple drive to meet a friend became a journey into oblivion? What if 20 minutes on a familiar road, a route you had traveled dozens of times before, became the last journey you would ever take? In 2002, in rural Washington state, a 24-year-old woman left her apartment on a sunny Saturday afternoon, headed to meet a friend for coffee just 20 minutes away. She kissed her reflection in the mirror, grabbed her keys, and walked out the door with nothing more pressing on her mind than catching up with her best friend over lattes and conversation. She never arrived. Her phone went silent. Her car vanished from the road. And by nightfall, everyone who knew her understood with terrible certainty that something had gone horribly wrong. This wasn't a woman who disappeared voluntarily. This wasn't someone running from problems or seeking a fresh start. This was a woman with roots, with plans, with people who loved her and expected her to walk through that diner door at 2 o'clock sharp. When she didn't, the alarm bells started ringing immediately. For over 2 decades, this cold case haunted investigators across Washington state. They knew someone had intercepted her on that quiet stretch of highway. They knew someone had ended her life and left her in a remote patch of forest, discarded like she meant nothing. But they couldn't prove who. The evidence from 2002 told a story without a villain. There was DNA under the victim's fingernails, proof that she had fought desperately against her attacker. There were tire impressions near her abandoned car. There were witness sightings of a dark pickup truck in the area. But none of it led anywhere. The case went cold. The files gathered dust. And the man responsible continued living his life as if nothing had happened. Then, in 2022, a decision to re-examine old evidence with new technology changed everything. The DNA profile that emerged pointed directly to a man who had been interviewed in 2002, a man who had offered his condolences to the victim's family, a man who had been hiding in plain sight for 21 years. His arrest shocked the entire community to its core, because he wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a drifter passing through town. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking on the margins of society. He was someone who had crossed her path that day with intention, with malice, and with a secret he thought he would carry to his grave. This is the story of Melissa Carpenter, a young woman whose ordinary Saturday became a 21-year mystery, and the breakthrough that finally brought her killer to justice. Let me introduce you to Melissa Anne Carpenter. 24 years old. 5'5" with shoulder-length brown hair she usually wore pulled back in a practical ponytail. Brown eyes that her friends described as warm, trusting, and quick to crinkle at the corners when she laughed. And Melissa laughed often. She had one of those laughs that filled a room, the kind that made other people smile even if they hadn't heard the joke. Her friends would later say that being around Melissa felt like standing in sunshine. She radiated warmth, kindness, and an authentic interest in the people around her. Melissa had grown up in Snohomish County, Washington, the middle child of 3 in a close-knit family that gathered every Sunday for dinner at her parents' home. Her older brother Michael worked as an electrician in Seattle. Her younger sister Jennifer was finishing her teaching degree at the University of Washington. And Melissa was the glue that held them all together. She was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, who organized family events, who called her siblings just to check in and see how they were doing. She was the one her parents turned to when they needed help with anything, from fixing a computer problem to mediating a disagreement. Her father, Robert Carpenter, worked as a machinist at a local manufacturing plant, a job he had held for over 30 years. He was a quiet man, steady and reliable, who expressed love through actions rather than words. He had taught Melissa to change a tire, balance a checkbook, and never let anyone make her feel small. Her mother, Diane, was a school secretary who knew every student by name and kept tissues in her desk for children having bad days. Melissa had inherited her mother's gift for connection, that rare ability to make everyone feel seen and valued. After graduating from Snohomish High School in 1996, Melissa had considered college but ultimately decided it wasn't for her. She was practical, grounded, more interested in building a life than chasing credentials. She took a job as an administrative assistant at Patterson Insurance Agency in Everett and discovered she was good at it. Really good. Her boss, Gerald Patterson, would later describe her as indispensable. Melissa didn't just do her job. She anticipated problems before they arose, and solved them without being asked. She remembered clients' names, their children's names, the details of their policies. She turned what could have been a sterile business transaction into a genuine human interaction. Melissa made people feel like they mattered, Gerald said in an interview years later. In the insurance business, that's rare. People come in stressed, worried about money, worried about coverage. Melissa put them at ease. She had a gift. By 2002, Melissa had been with the company for 6 years and had been promoted twice. She wasn't getting rich, but she was building something. Stability, security, a foundation for the future she was beginning to imagine. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment about 15 miles from her parents' home, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to establish her independence. The apartment was on the second floor of a quiet complex surrounded by tall pine trees, the kind of place where neighbors nodded hello but mostly kept to themselves. Melissa had decorated the space herself, filling it with thrift store finds that she refinished on weekends. A vintage dresser painted robin's egg blue. A set of mismatched chairs around a small dining table. Plants on every windowsill, which she watered religiously every Sunday morning before driving to her parents' house for dinner. She loved those plants. Spider plants, pothos, a fiddle leaf fig she had nursed back from the brink of death after buying at half price from a garden center. Her apartment felt alive, welcoming, a reflection of the woman who lived there. Melissa's social circle was small but solid. She had maintained friendships from high school, gathered new ones from work, and stayed close to her siblings despite their busy lives. She wasn't the type to have 100 acquaintances. She preferred a handful of deep connections to a crowd of superficial ones. Her best friend was Nicole Patterson, the daughter of her boss. They had met when Melissa started at the agency and had clicked immediately. Despite the potential awkwardness of Nicole being the boss's daughter, their friendship had flourished. Every few weeks, they met for coffee at a diner halfway between their homes, a ritual they had maintained for years. They talked about everything at those coffee dates. Work, family, relationships, dreams. Nicole knew things about Melissa that no one else did, and vice versa. They were the kind of friends who could go weeks without talking and pick up exactly where they left off. In the months before her disappearance, Melissa had started dating someone new. His name was Chris Devlin, a 27-year-old who worked in IT at a company in Everett. They had met through mutual friends at a barbecue that summer and had been seeing each other for about 3 months. The relationship was still in its early stages, that tentative period where everything feels exciting but also uncertain. Melissa had confided to Nicole that she was optimistic about Chris. He was kind, she said, respectful. He made her laugh and didn't pressure her about anything. I think this one might actually be different, Melissa had told Nicole during their last coffee date, just 2 weeks before she disappeared. He listens, you know? Actually listens. And he remembers things I tell him. Melissa wasn't the type to take risks or court danger. She locked her doors religiously. She called her parents when she got home from late shifts. She avoided driving after dark on unfamiliar roads and always kept her gas tank at least half full. She was careful by nature, practical by disposition, and surrounded by people who loved her. None of that saved her. On Saturday, September 14th, 2002, Melissa was supposed to meet Nicole at their usual spot at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a routine they had followed countless times, a small pleasure in the rhythm of their lives. The drive should have taken 20 minutes, mostly along Highway 9, a scenic 2-lane road that wound through farmland and forest. Melissa had driven that route dozens of times. She knew every curve, every landmark, every spot where you could pull over to admire the mountain views on clear days. She left her apartment around 1:30, giving herself plenty of time. She was wearing jeans, a green sweater she had bought at a boutique in downtown Everett, and the silver bracelet her grandmother had given her for her 21st birthday. She locked her door, walked down the stairs to the parking lot, climbed into her silver Honda Civic, and drove away. Somewhere between her apartment and that diner, somewhere on that familiar stretch of Highway 9, Melissa Carpenter vanished. And for 21 years, no one knew why. Nicole Patterson arrived at the Riverside Diner at 5 minutes to 2, sliding into their usual booth by the window where she could watch the parking lot. The diner was a comfortable place, the kind of establishment that hadn't changed its decor since the 1980s and was better for it. Red vinyl booths, a long formica counter, the smell of coffee and bacon grease hanging in the air. Melissa and Nicole had been coming here for years, always sitting in the same spot, always ordering the same drinks. Nicole ordered a latte and waited. She wasn't worried at first. Melissa was punctual, almost obsessively so, but traffic happened. Unexpected delays happened. 5 minutes late was nothing to panic about. 2 o'clock came and went. Then 2:15. Then 2:30. Nicole checked her phone repeatedly, expecting to see a text or missed call explaining the delay. There was nothing. This wasn't like Melissa. If she was running late, she called. If plans changed, she sent a message. She was considerate that way, almost to a fault, always thinking about how her actions affected others. By 2:45, Nicole's mild annoyance had transformed into genuine concern. She called Melissa's cell phone, listening to it ring 4 times before going to voicemail. "Hey, it's me. I'm at the diner. Where are you? Call me back." She waited 5 minutes and called again. Same result. She tried Melissa's apartment landline. No answer. At 3 o'clock, struggling to keep her voice casual, Nicole called Melissa's mother. "Hey Diane, it's Nicole. Have you heard from Melissa today? She was supposed to meet me for coffee, and she never showed up." Diane hadn't heard from her daughter since the previous evening, when Melissa had called to confirm Sunday dinner plans. "That's strange," Diane said, her voice already tightening with worry. "She was looking forward to seeing you. She mentioned it last night." "I'm sure it's nothing," Nicole said, not believing her own words. "She probably just got held up. I'll try her again." But as Nicole hung up the phone, she felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. Something was wrong. She knew it with a certainty that defied logic. Diane Carpenter felt it too. Over the next hour, Diane began making calls of her own. To Melissa's workplace, where the answering machine picked up because the office was closed on Saturdays. To her other friends, none of whom had spoken to her that day. To her brother Michael, who hadn't heard from her. To her sister Jennifer, same story. Finally, Diane called Chris Devlin, Melissa's boyfriend. Chris said he had texted Melissa that morning around 10 o'clock, just a casual message asking about her plans for the weekend. She had replied cheerfully, mentioning her coffee date with Nicole and asking if he wanted to get dinner later that evening. He had said yes. They had made plans for 7 o'clock. That was the last anyone had heard from Melissa Carpenter. By 4 o'clock, Robert Carpenter had driven to his daughter's apartment complex. He parked next to a silver Honda Civic that wasn't there and climbed the stairs to her unit. The door was locked. He knocked repeatedly, called her name, pressed his ear against the wood hoping to hear movement inside. Nothing. Through the window, he could see her purse sitting on the kitchen counter, her jacket draped over a chair, a coffee mug in the dish rack drying from that morning. Everything looked normal, undisturbed. Her car was gone. Her keys were gone. She had clearly left voluntarily. But she had never arrived anywhere. Robert called 911 at 4:30. His voice steady but tight with controlled fear. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office took the report, but in 2002, adults who had been missing for only a few hours didn't trigger immediate large-scale responses. The deputy who spoke to Robert was sympathetic but measured in his concern. "Sir, I understand you're worried, but your daughter is an adult. She's been out of contact for less than 3 hours. There could be any number of explanations. Perhaps her phone had died. Perhaps she had decided to stop somewhere unexpectedly. Perhaps she was already home and simply not answering the door for some reason." Robert Carpenter had been a father for 30 years. He had watched his children grow up, had learned their rhythms and habits better than he knew his own. "My daughter doesn't do this," he said firmly. "She doesn't disappear. She doesn't miss plans without calling. Something happened to her." The deputy promised to file a report and have patrol units keep an eye out for Melissa's vehicle. But Robert could hear the dismissal in his tone. Another worried parent overreacting. By nightfall, with still no word from Melissa, the family had organized their own search. Robert, Diane, Michael, Jennifer, Nicole, Chris, and a handful of other friends and relatives drove the route Melissa should have taken, scanning the shoulders of Highway 9 for any sign of her silver Honda Civic. They checked every parking lot along the way, every gas station, every diner and convenience store and roadside attraction. Nothing. At 9:17 that evening, Robert Carpenter's worst fears were confirmed. A family friend who had been searching a more remote section of the highway spotted Melissa's car. It was parked in a pullout along a particularly isolated stretch of the road, a spot where hikers sometimes left vehicles to access nearby trails. The car sat alone in the gravel lot, illuminated by the sweep of the searcher's headlights. No other vehicles around. No people. Robert arrived within 15 minutes, his heart hammering in his chest. The car was empty. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still in the ignition. Melissa's cell phone was on the passenger seat, powered off. Her purse was not in the vehicle. Neither was her wallet. And there was no sign of Melissa. No sign of struggle, no damage to the vehicle. Nothing to explain why a young woman on her way to meet a friend would have pulled over in this isolated location, miles from her destination, and never returned. This time, when Robert called 911, the response was immediate. Within an hour, the pullout was swarming with deputies, crime scene technicians, and search and rescue volunteers. Floodlights illuminated the gravel lot and the tree line beyond. Dogs were brought in, trained to track human scent. They picked up Melissa's trail leading from the car toward the woods, then lost it about 50 yards into the forest, as if she had simply evaporated into the darkness. The search continued through the night, flashlight beams sweeping through the trees, voices calling Melissa's name into the void. No one answered. 36 hours later, they found her. Melissa's body was discovered on Monday morning, September 16, 2002, by a search dog named Ranger. She was found in a densely wooded area approximately 200 yards from where her car had been parked, concealed beneath fallen branches, leaves, and forest debris in what appeared to be a hasty attempt at burial. The concealment had been ineffective. Ranger had alerted to the site within minutes of entering the search grid. Detective Frank Reyes of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office was among the first responders on scene. A 15-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. Reyes later admitted that the sight of Melissa Carpenter's body affected him profoundly. She looked peaceful in death, he would write in his notes, almost like she was sleeping. But the violence that had been done to her was unmistakable. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be ligature strangulation. Melissa had been killed by someone who wrapped something around her throat, likely a rope or cord, and squeezed until she stopped breathing. The estimated time of death was Saturday afternoon or evening, within hours of her disappearance. There was evidence of a violent struggle. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms, where she had tried to fend off her attacker. Broken fingernails on her right hand. Bruising on her wrists consistent with being restrained. And under those broken fingernails, the medical examiner found something potentially invaluable. Skin cells. Foreign DNA. Melissa Carpenter had fought back. She had scratched her attacker hard enough to draw blood, to collect genetic material that could one day identify her killer. In 2002, DNA technology was advancing rapidly, but it still had significant limitations. The samples recovered from Melissa's fingernails were submitted to the state crime lab for analysis. The results came back 6 weeks later. Analysts had been able to develop a partial profile, but it wasn't complete enough to run through CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. The partial profile sat in the case file, tantalizing and frustrating in equal measure. The killer's genetic signature was there, but investigators couldn't use it. Not yet. Detective Reyes attacked the investigation with methodical determination. He understood that the first 72 hours were critical, and while that window had passed before Melissa's body was even found, there was still work to be done. His team began with the obvious questions. Who had Melissa encountered on that stretch of Highway 9? Who had the means, motive, and opportunity to intercept her, overpower her, and kill her? The boyfriend was interviewed first. Chris Devlin came to the station voluntarily, visibly shaken and cooperative. His alibi was solid. At the time of Melissa's disappearance, Chris had been at his parents' home in Kirkland, 30 miles away, attending his nephew's 5th birthday party. There were photographs, witnesses, credit card receipts from the party supply store. Over a dozen family members confirmed his presence throughout the afternoon and evening. Chris was devastated. He answered every question, provided every piece of information requested, and broke down crying twice during the interview. Reyes crossed him off the list. Former boyfriends were investigated next. Melissa had dated a few men before Chris, none of the relationships serious or ending badly. Each former partner had an alibi. Each expressed shock and sadness at what had happened. Co-workers were interviewed. Clients from the insurance agency. Neighbors from her apartment complex. Everyone who had interacted with Melissa in the weeks before her death was tracked down and questioned. No one emerged as a clear suspect. There was no stalker that anyone knew of. No threats. No angry ex-boyfriends or disgruntled customers. Melissa had no enemies. No conflicts. No secret life that might have put her in danger. She was, by all accounts, exactly what she appeared to be. A kind, ordinary young woman who had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. Attention turned to the crime scene and the physical evidence. Highway 9 was a well-traveled road, but the pullout where Melissa's car had been found was relatively isolated. It sat at the end of a curve, partially hidden from the main road by a stand of trees. Someone would have needed to know it existed, to know that it offered a degree of privacy from passing traffic. Tire impressions were found in the gravel near Melissa's car, impressions that didn't match her Honda Civic. They were from a truck, the techs determined, probably a full-size pickup. The impressions were photographed and cast, but the tread pattern was common, used on tires sold by the millions across the country. Investigators theorized 2 scenarios. Either Melissa had pulled over voluntarily, perhaps to help someone who appeared to be in distress, or she had been forced off the road by another vehicle. There was no damage to her car consistent with being run off the road, no scrapes or dents that would suggest a collision. The voluntary stop theory gained favor. Witness canvassing along Highway 9 produced limited results. Several drivers recalled seeing a silver Honda matching Melissa's car on the road that afternoon. A few had noticed it parked in the pullout, though they couldn't agree on what time. One witness, a truck driver named Earl Patterson, no relation to Nicole, remembered something more specific. He had been heading north on Highway 9 around 2 o'clock, maybe a little after, when he passed the pullout and noticed 2 vehicles. A silver car and a dark-colored pickup truck, possibly dark blue or black. He didn't see any people. Didn't think anything of it at the time. I figured it was just folks taking a break, Earl told investigators. Maybe looking at the scenery or checking a map. You see that kind of thing all the time on these back roads. The pickup truck became the focus of the investigation. Reyes and his team ran queries on registered pickup truck owners in a 50-mile radius. The list was enormous, hundreds of vehicles matching the general description. Rural Washington was pickup truck country. They narrowed the list based on proximity to the crime scene, any prior criminal history, any connection to the victim however tenuous. One by one, they interviewed truck owners. One of those interviews was with a man named Derek Hollis. Derek was 31 years old in September 2002. He lived about 10 miles from the crime scene in a small house he was renovating himself. He worked as a general contractor, specializing in residential construction and home improvement projects. He drove a 2000 Ford F-150 in what he described as Pacific blue, a dark blue-gray color that could easily be mistaken for black or dark blue depending on the lighting. On September 18th, just 4 days after Melissa's disappearance, Detective Reyes knocked on Derek's door. Derek answered in jeans and a work shirt, sawdust still clinging to his forearms. He was cooperative from the start, friendly even. "I heard about that on the news," Derek said when Reyes explained the reason for the visit. "Terrible thing. That poor woman." When asked about his whereabouts on Saturday afternoon, Derek provided a vague but plausible account. He had been running errands, he said. Hardware store, gas station, maybe a stop at the grocery store. Nothing special. He couldn't remember the exact times, but he was certain he had been nowhere near that pullout on Highway 9. "I might have driven down that road at some point," Derek acknowledged. "I drive all over the county for work, but I definitely wasn't stopping at any pullouts or anything like that." His demeanor was calm, helpful, concerned. He offered to provide receipts if he could find them, though he admitted he wasn't great about keeping track of paperwork. Reyes took notes, assessed the man in front of him. Nothing about Derek Hollis screamed, "Killer." He was articulate, employed, established in the community. His truck matched the general description, but so did hundreds of others. He had no apparent connection to the victim. There was no physical evidence linking Derek to the crime. No witnesses who could place him at the scene. No DNA match, because the partial profile from Melissa's fingernails wasn't usable. The interview was filed away. Derek Hollis became just another name in a case file that was growing thicker by the day but no closer to resolution. Weeks turned into months. The leads dried up one by one. The dark pickup truck was never definitively identified. The witness who had seen it couldn't provide a license plate, couldn't describe the driver, couldn't offer anything more than a vague impression of a vehicle that might have been there. By the spring of 2003, the investigation had stalled completely. Without new evidence, without a clear suspect, without the ability to use the DNA profile that was sitting tantalizingly in the case file, there was nowhere left to go. Melissa Carpenter's murder became a cold case. Detective Reyes cleared his desk, moved the files to storage, and turned his attention to other cases. But he kept copies of everything in a box at home. "I always knew we would solve it eventually," he said years later. "I just didn't know how long it would take." The years that followed were a slow torture for the Carpenter family. Every holiday without Melissa was a reminder of what they had lost. Every birthday she should have celebrated. Every family dinner with an empty chair at the table. Diane Carpenter stopped sleeping through the night. Robert threw himself into work, staying late at the plant to avoid coming home to a house haunted by memories. Michael and Jennifer struggled to move forward with their own lives while carrying the weight of unresolved grief. But the Carpenters refused to let Melissa become just another statistic, another name on a list of unsolved homicides. Every year on September 14th, the anniversary of Melissa's disappearance, the family held a memorial gathering at a park near her apartment. Friends, relatives, co-workers, and community members would gather to share memories, light candles, and renew their commitment to seeking justice. Media outlets would often attend, running stories that inevitably included appeals for anyone with information to come forward. "Someone knows what happened to my daughter," Diane said at the 10-year anniversary gathering in 2012, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Someone saw something. Someone is keeping a secret that has haunted this family for a decade. Please, if you know anything, come forward. Help us find peace." The tips that came in over the years led nowhere. False confessions from troubled individuals seeking attention. Psychic visions that didn't match any known evidence. Well-meaning speculation from amateur detectives who had watched too many crime shows. None of it produced actionable leads. Detective Reyes retired in 2010 after 30 years with the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. On his last day, he packed up his personal belongings and handed a thick folder to his colleague, a younger detective named Sandra Kim. "This is the Carpenter case," he said. "Everything I've got. Promise me you won't let it die." Sandra promised. She spent her first week reviewing the files, familiarizing herself with the evidence, the suspects who had been ruled out, the leads that had gone cold. She visited the crime scene, walked the route Melissa would have taken, tried to imagine what might have happened on that September afternoon. But without new evidence, without fresh leads, there was nothing she could do that hadn't already been done. The case file went back to storage. In 2008, advances in DNA technology prompted a re-examination of the biological evidence. The partial profile developed in 2002 was sent to the state crime lab with a request for enhanced analysis. The results were disappointing. While the technology had improved, the original samples had degraded over the intervening years. Analysts were able to refine the profile slightly, but it still wasn't complete enough to generate a reliable Cody's match. The case file went back to storage again. Meanwhile, life went on for everyone else connected to the investigation. Nicole Patterson, Melissa's best friend, eventually moved to Portland, married, had 2 children. She named her daughter Melissa, a tribute to the friend she had lost. She still thought about their last conversation, still wondered what she might have done differently. Chris Devlin, Melissa's boyfriend, spent years struggling with survivor's guilt and depression. He moved away from Washington entirely, eventually settling in Arizona where no one knew his story. He never married. Gerald Patterson sold the insurance agency in 2005 and retired to Florida. He kept a photograph of Melissa on his desk until the day he died. And Derek Hollis continued living his life as if nothing had happened. He remained in Snohomish County, building his contracting business into a successful operation with a half-dozen employees. He married a woman named Karen in 2005, a kindergarten teacher who had no idea about the darkness hiding inside her husband. They had 2 children together, a boy and a girl. Derek coached his son's Little League team, served on the PTA, attended church on Sundays. He was known in the community as a reliable businessman, a good neighbor, the kind of man who showed up when someone needed help. He donated to local charities, volunteered at community cleanup events, and maintained a reputation as an upstanding citizen. No one suspected a thing, because Derek Hollis had learned how to compartmentalize. He had taken what he did on September 14, 2002, and locked it away in a corner of his mind that he rarely accessed. He told himself it had been an accident, a moment of lost control that didn't define who he really was. He told himself a lot of things. But late at night, when the house was quiet and Karen was asleep beside him, Derek would sometimes lie awake staring at the ceiling, remembering the way Melissa had looked when he first approached her car, remembering the fear in her eyes when she realized what was happening, remembering the feel of the rope in his hands, the struggling that eventually stopped. He would push those memories away, bury them under layers of rationalization and denial. But they never truly disappeared. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Derek Hollis knew that what he had done would eventually catch up with him. He just didn't know when. In 2022, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office launched an ambitious initiative to address its growing backlog of cold cases. Budget increases and advances in forensic technology had created new opportunities to revisit old investigations. Cases that had seemed hopeless a decade ago might now be solvable with modern tools. Detective Amanda Chun was assigned to lead the cold case unit. At 38 years old, Chun represented a new generation of investigators who had grown up with DNA technology, genetic genealogy, and digital forensics as standard tools of the trade. She had joined the department in 2008, just 2 years before Detective Reyes retired. They had overlapped briefly, and Reyes had made an impression on her. Frank used to talk about the Carpenter case, Chun recalled. He said it haunted him, said the answer was in those files somewhere, and he just couldn't see it. When Chun took over the cold case unit, the Carpenter investigation was one of the first files she pulled. She spent 3 weeks immersed in the evidence, reading every interview transcript, examining every photograph, tracing every lead that had been pursued and abandoned. The case had all the hallmarks of a solvable crime. There was biological evidence, DNA under the victim's fingernails. There was a clear crime scene with physical evidence that had been properly collected and preserved. There were witness statements that provided at least partial information. What the case lacked was the technology to connect those pieces. But it was 2022 now. The technology existed. Chun partnered with a specialized forensic laboratory in Virginia that used cutting-edge extraction techniques and genetic genealogy methods. These labs had revolutionized cold case investigation over the previous decade, solving murders that had gone unsolved for 30, 40, even 50 years. The key was their ability to work with degraded samples. DNA from old evidence often breaks down over time, becoming fragmented and difficult to analyze. Traditional crime labs struggled with these samples, but specialized facilities had developed techniques to extract usable genetic material from evidence that previous generations would have written off as worthless. In March of 2022, Detective Chun submitted the remaining biological evidence from Melissa Carpenter's case to the Virginia lab. The process took 7 months. 7 months of painstaking work, extracting genetic material from the fingernail scrapings that had been collected during Melissa's autopsy more than 2 decades earlier. 7 months of building a profile piece by piece, from samples that had degraded significantly over 20 years of storage. 7 months of hope and uncertainty, of waiting and wondering if this effort would produce results or simply add another disappointing chapter to an already frustrating case. In October of 2022, almost exactly 20 years after Melissa's murder, the lab delivered its findings. They had successfully developed a complete DNA profile from the evidence. The profile was uploaded to Cody's immediately, and within 48 hours it generated a match. The DNA belonged to Derek Allen Hollis. Detective Chun stared at the results on her computer screen, her heart pounding. She pulled the original case file and found the interview notes from September 2002. Derek Hollis, age 31, contractor, drove a dark blue Ford F-150, interviewed and cleared. He had been questioned. He had provided an explanation. He had expressed sympathy for the victim's family. And then he had walked away. For 21 years, the answer had been sitting in a filing cabinet, overlooked, forgotten, waiting for the technology to catch up with the crime. Chun immediately requested Derek's current information. He was still living in Snohomish County, still married, still operating his contracting business, still attending church on Sundays, coaching youth sports, presenting himself as an upstanding member of the community. The monster had been hiding in plain sight all along. But Chun knew that a DNA match alone might not be enough for a conviction. Defense attorneys would challenge the evidence, question chain of custody, raise doubts about contamination and degradation. She needed more, and she was determined to find it. The investigation that followed Derek Hollis's identification as a suspect was meticulous, drawing on techniques and resources that hadn't existed in 2002. Detective Chun assembled a team of investigators, analysts, and forensic specialists. They divided the work into parallel tracks, each team focusing on a different aspect of the case. The first track involved reconstructing Derek's movements on September 14, 2002. 20 years had passed, but records still existed. Credit card statements, bank records, cell phone logs, business receipts. Chen's team obtained subpoenas for every piece of documentation they could identify. The results were damning. Credit card records showed that Derek had purchased gas at a Chevron station about 3 miles from the crime scene at 1:45 in the afternoon, just 15 minutes before Melissa would have been driving along Highway 9. The gas station was on the route she would have taken. Derek would have been in perfect position to spot her car, to follow her, to wait for an opportunity. Cell phone records from 2002 were limited compared to modern standards, but what existed was significant. Derek's phone had pinged off a cell tower consistent with the Highway 9 location between 1:50 and 3 o'clock that afternoon. He had told investigators he was running errands, nowhere near that pullout. The records proved otherwise. The second track focused on Derek's background and behavioral history. Chen's team conducted dozens of interviews with people who had known Derek over the past 2 decades. Former employers, former girlfriends, neighbors, colleagues, anyone who might have insight into the man behind the respectable facade. A disturbing pattern emerged. Several former acquaintances described Derek as having a temper that could flare unexpectedly, particularly when he had been drinking. He was described as charming on the surface but controlling in relationships, the kind of man who needed to be in charge. A former girlfriend from the late 1990s, tracked down after extensive searching, described an incident that had never been reported to police. "We had been dating for about 6 months, she said, her voice tight with remembered fear. "We got into an argument about something stupid. I don't even remember what, and he just snapped. He grabbed me by the throat and shoved me against the wall. For a few seconds, I thought he was going to kill me." She had broken up with him the next day and moved away shortly after. "I always wondered if he had done something like that to someone else," she said. "I guess now I know." The third track examined the physical evidence with fresh eyes and modern technology. The tire impressions from the crime scene had been photographed and cast in 2002, but the analysis had been inconclusive. The tread pattern was common, found on tires sold across the country. Now, using advanced image enhancement software, forensic analysts were able to refine the analysis. The impressions were consistent with tires commonly installed on Ford F-150 trucks manufactured between 1997 and 2002. Derek had owned a 2000 F-150, but the most significant physical evidence came from an unexpected source. Chen's team traced the ownership history of Derek's truck. He had sold it in 2007, and it had passed through several owners over the following years. Most would have been dead ends, but one owner had been a collector who specialized in vintage trucks and kept vehicles in storage for years. The truck was located in a barn in rural Oregon, still registered, still intact. With a warrant in hand, forensic technicians examined the vehicle. Despite 2 decades, traces of evidence remained. In the bed of the truck, beneath a layer of grime and rust, analysts found fibers. Green fibers, synthetic, consistent with the type of material used in mass-produced sweaters in the early 2000s. The same type of material as the green sweater Melissa Carpenter had been wearing the day she was murdered. The fibers were sent for analysis and comparison. They matched. The 4th track was perhaps the most important, preparing for a re-interview of the suspect. Chun studied the transcript of Derek's 2002 interview carefully. He had been vague about his whereabouts, non-committal about specific times, generally cooperative but unhelpful. She identified the weaknesses in his story, the places where his account contradicted the new evidence, the opportunities to catch him in lies. In August of 2023, she arranged for Derek to be brought in for questioning. The interview was conducted at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, in a room with recording equipment capturing every word and gesture. Derek arrived looking confident, even relaxed. He was 52 years old now, his hair graying at the temples, but still projecting the same affable charm that had served him so well for decades. "I'm happy to help however I can," he said as he settled into his chair. "Though I have to say, I'm not sure what I could possibly contribute after all this time." Chun started slowly, walking him through his original statement, confirming details, giving him every opportunity to provide the same account he had given in 2002. Derek obliged, repeating his story about running errands, being nowhere near the crime scene. Then Chun began introducing the new evidence. The credit card record from the gas station, the cell tower data, the fiber evidence from his truck. With each revelation, Derek's composure cracked a little more. He tried to explain away the gas station purchase. Maybe he had been in that area after all, he couldn't really remember, it was 20 years ago. He dismissed the cell tower data as imprecise, unreliable, meaningless. But when Chun mentioned the fibers, the green fibers found in his truck bed that matched Melissa's sweater, something changed in Derek's face. He was silent for a long moment. "I don't know anything about any green sweater," he finally said. "I never saw what she was wearing that day." Chun felt her pulse quicken. She hadn't mentioned the color of the sweater. She had only referenced fibers from the victim's clothing. That detail, the color of Melissa's sweater, had been deliberately withheld from public reports. It was holdback evidence, information known only to investigators and the killer. Derek Hollis had just revealed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. Chun pressed him on it. How did he know the sweater was green? Derek's face went pale. He stumbled over his words, trying to backtrack, claiming he must have read it somewhere, heard it on the news years ago. But there was nowhere he could have learned that information. The color of Melissa's sweater had never been released publicly, unless he had been there. The interview ended shortly afterward. Derek demanded a lawyer, finally understanding the trap that had been closing around him. But the damage was done. His own words had condemned him. In the days following the interview, Detective Chun assembled the final pieces of the case against Derek Hollis. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The genetic profile from Melissa's fingernail scrapings matched Derek with a probability of error so small it was essentially zero. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The credit card records placing him near the crime scene. The cell tower data contradicting his alibi. The fiber evidence from his truck. And his own incriminating statement about the green sweater, captured on video, impossible to explain away. But Chun wanted to understand the full picture. Not just what Derek had done, but why. The investigation had revealed no prior connection between Derek and Melissa. They didn't know each other. They hadn't attended the same church, frequented the same businesses, moved in the same social circles. As far as anyone could determine, Melissa Carpenter had been a stranger to Derek Hollis, which meant her murder had been either random or opportunistic. Chun believed it was the latter. Derek had been driving along Highway 9 on that September afternoon when he spotted Melissa's silver Honda. He had followed her, perhaps for miles, waiting for an opportunity. When she pulled into that isolated turnout, maybe to check a map, maybe to answer a phone call, maybe just to take a break from driving, Derek had seen his chance. He had pulled in behind her, approached her car with a friendly demeanor, perhaps claiming car trouble of his own, perhaps asking for directions. Melissa, trusting by nature, would have rolled down her window, would have tried to help. And that was all the opening Derek needed. The attack had happened fast. The evidence suggested a blitz assault, overwhelming violence designed to incapacitate the victim before she could scream or escape. But Melissa had fought back. She had scratched Derek's face or hands hard enough to collect DNA under her nails. She had struggled against the rope he wrapped around her throat. In the end, it hadn't been enough. Derek had strangled her, dragged her body into the woods, and made a hasty attempt to conceal it. Then he had driven away, leaving her car in the pull-out with the keys in the ignition, a puzzle for investigators who would spend the next 2 decades trying to solve it. Back home, Derek had cleaned himself up, bandaged any scratches Melissa had inflicted, and gone on with his life as if nothing had happened. The psychological compartmentalization required for such behavior was difficult to comprehend. But Chun had seen it before in other cases. Some killers were able to separate their crimes from their everyday existence, to maintain normal relationships and social roles while carrying secrets that would horrify anyone who knew them. Derek Hollis had been living a double life for 21 years. The devoted husband and father, the respected businessman, the community volunteer, none of it had been real. Or perhaps all of it had been real, in a way that made the underlying truth even more disturbing. Monsters don't always look like monsters. A warrant for Derek's arrest was issued on September 1, 2023. The arrest happened at 7 o'clock on a Friday morning. Detective Chun led a team of officers to Derek Hollis's home, a well-maintained craftsman-style house in a quiet residential neighborhood where children rode bikes and neighbors waved to each other across manicured lawns. Derek was in the kitchen when he heard the knock, still wearing the t-shirt and sweatpants he had slept in. His wife Karen was upstairs getting ready for work. Their children, now teenagers, had already left for school. When Derek opened the door and saw the officers, something in his face shifted. He didn't seem surprised. "Derek Allen Hollis," Chun said. "You're under arrest for the murder of Melissa Anne Carpenter." Karen appeared at the top of the stairs, confusion and fear written across her features. "Derek? What's happening? What are they talking about?" Derek didn't answer her. He stood perfectly still as an officer cuffed his hands behind his back and read him his rights. "I've been waiting for this," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I always knew it would catch up to me eventually." Karen screamed his name as he was led to the patrol car. She ran down the stairs, demanding answers, begging the officers to tell her what was happening. No one could give her the words that would make any of it make sense. Derek Hollis was transported to the Snohomish County Jail, where he was processed, photographed, and placed in a holding cell to await arraignment. The news of his arrest spread through the community like wildfire. Within hours, reporters were camped outside his home, his business, the courthouse. His employees were ambushed with microphones as they arrived at work. His neighbors were asked to describe the man they thought they knew. The reactions ranged from disbelief to horror to a strange, unsettling sense of recognition. "I always thought there was something off about him," one neighbor said. "The way he looked at women sometimes. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. He coached my son's baseball team," another neighbor said, her voice shaking. "He was at our house for birthday parties. How do you process something like that?" Derek's wife Karen released a brief statement through an attorney, expressing shock and maintaining her husband's innocence. But she filed for divorce within 3 months and moved away with the children before the trial began. For the Carpenter family, the arrest brought a complicated flood of emotions. Robert and Diane were in their late 70s now, their health declining, their lives forever altered by the loss of their daughter. They had spent 21 years waiting for this moment. But the moment didn't bring joy. It brought relief, certainly. It brought a sense of justice long delayed. But it also brought fresh grief, fresh pain, the reopening of wounds that had never fully healed. "I thought I would feel happy," Diane told a reporter outside the courthouse on the day of Derek's arraignment. "I thought I would feel satisfied, vindicated. But mostly I just feel sad. Sad that it took so long. Sad that Melissa isn't here to see this. Sad that this man got to live his life while my daughter rotted in a grave." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. "But at least now we know. At least now the world knows who he really is." The trial of Derek Allen Hollis began on March 4, 2024, in Snohomish County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and members of both families. The Carpenters sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, their faces drawn and tired but resolute. Derek's side of the gallery was notably sparse. His children did not attend. His ex-wife did not attend. A few distant relatives and former colleagues appeared briefly, but most stayed away, unwilling to be associated with what he was accused of. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney Rachel Okonkwo, a 15-year veteran of the office with a reputation for meticulous preparation and powerful closing arguments. The defense was handled by William Marsh, a private attorney hired by Derek's family. Marsh was experienced, skilled, and facing an almost impossible task. Opening statements set the tone for what would follow. Okonkwo spoke first, her voice calm but intense. 21 years ago, Melissa Carpenter left her home to meet a friend for coffee. She never arrived. She was intercepted on a quiet stretch of highway by a predator who saw an opportunity. He attacked her. He strangled her. He buried her body in the woods and went home to live his life as if nothing had happened. She paused, letting the words sink in. That predator is sitting in this courtroom today. His name is Derek Hollis. And for 21 years, he has walked among us, pretending to be something he isn't. Family man, a businessman, a pillar of the community. But science doesn't lie. DNA doesn't lie. And the evidence in this case will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Derek Hollis murdered Melissa Carpenter. Marsh's opening was measured, acknowledging the difficulty of his position while attempting to plant seeds of doubt. The prosecution will present evidence that has been stored for over 2 decades, evidence that has been handled by countless individuals, stored in conditions that may have allowed contamination or degradation. They will ask you to believe that DNA recovered from 20-year-old samples is reliable enough to convict a man of murder. They will ask you to ignore the possibility of error, of mistake, of innocent explanations. Derek Hollis has lived an exemplary life for over 50 years. He has built businesses, raised a family, contributed to his community. The prosecution wants you to believe he is a monster hiding behind a mask. But what if he's simply an innocent man caught up in a system desperate for answers? The evidence phase began with the forensic testimony. Dr. Patricia Huang, a DNA specialist from the Virginia laboratory, spent 2 full days on the stand explaining the extraction process, the analysis methodology, and the statistical certainty of the match. Under direct examination, she walked the jury through the science in accessible terms. The probability that the DNA profile recovered from the victim's fingernails belongs to someone other than the defendant is approximately 1 in 7.4 trillion, she explained. To put that in perspective, there are currently about 8 billion people on Earth. The chance of a random match is essentially 0. Cross-examination focused on chain of custody and degradation. Marsh pressed Dr. Huang on the age of the samples, the storage conditions, the potential for contamination. "Isn't it true that DNA degrades over time?" he asked. "Yes, that's correct," Dr. Huang acknowledged. "And isn't it true that degraded samples can produce unreliable results?" That can be true in some circumstances, she admitted. But in this case, we were able to develop a complete profile despite the degradation. The methods we use are specifically designed to work with challenging samples. But you can't guarantee that no contamination occurred at any point over 20 years? No laboratory can guarantee that, Dr. Huang said evenly. But we can evaluate the probability based on the evidence. And in this case, the profile is clean, consistent, and matches the defendant with overwhelming statistical certainty. The circumstantial evidence followed. Investigators testified about the credit card records, the cell phone tower data, the tire impressions, the fiber evidence from Derek's truck. Each piece alone might have been explicable. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Detective Chun took the stand to describe the 2023 interview and Derek's incriminating statement about the green sweater. I asked the defendant about fiber evidence from the victim's clothing, Chun testified. He responded by saying he didn't know anything about any green sweater and had never seen what she was wearing. At that point, had you mentioned the color of the sweater? Konkwo asked. No, I had only referenced fibers from the victim's clothing generally. The color was never specified. And was the color of the sweater ever made public? No. It was holdback evidence, deliberately withheld from all public reports. So how could the defendant have known the sweater was green? He couldn't have, Chin said, unless he was there. The defense attempted to suggest that the sweater color might have leaked somehow, might have been mentioned in passing by someone over the years. But they could produce no evidence to support this theory. The emotional heart of the trial came when Melissa's loved ones testified. Nicole Patterson described the last conversation she had with Melissa, the plans they had made, the coffee date that never happened. She was my best friend, Nicole said, her voice breaking. She was supposed to meet me at 2 o'clock. I sat there waiting and she never came. I've thought about that day every single day for 21 years. Chris Devlin testified about the relationship he and Melissa had been building, the future they had imagined together. I had started looking at engagement rings, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I was going to ask her to marry me that Christmas. We had our whole lives ahead of us. He paused, composing himself. Derek Hollis took all of that away. He took her life, her future, everything she could have been. And then he went home and lived his life like nothing happened. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Closing arguments were delivered on a gray Thursday morning. Okonkwo spoke for nearly 2 hours, weaving together the evidence into a narrative that left no room for doubt. This case is about evidence, she said. DNA evidence that places the defendant's genetic material on the victim's body. Physical evidence that places his vehicle at the crime scene. Documentary evidence that contradicts his alibi. And his own words, captured on video, revealing knowledge he should never have possessed. Derek Hollis murdered Melissa Carpenter. He has escaped justice for 21 years. But justice has finally caught up with him. Find him guilty. Give Melissa and her family the peace they deserve. Marsh made his final appeal to reasonable doubt. The prosecution has presented evidence that is 2 decades old. Evidence that has been stored, handled, and tested multiple times. Evidence that could have been contaminated at any point. They ask you to convict based on probability and statistics. But probability is not certainty. Statistics are not facts. If there is any doubt in your mind, any question about whether this evidence proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, you must acquit. The jury deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreperson stood, cleared his throat, and read the verdict. We, the jury, in the matter of the state of Washington versus Derek Allen Hollis, find the defendant guilty of murder in the 1st degree. A sob escaped from somewhere in the gallery. Whether it was relief or grief was impossible to tell. We further find the defendant guilty of kidnapping in the 1st degree. Derek Hollis showed no visible reaction. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask. But his hands, resting on the defense table, were trembling. The sentencing hearing took place 8 weeks later, on a date chosen with deliberate symbolism. September 14th, 2024. 22 years to the day since Melissa Carpenter was murdered. The courtroom was packed once again. The Carpenter family sat in their usual place, their faces showing the exhaustion of a journey that had spanned more than 2 decades. Before Judge Margaret Liu announced the sentence, she allowed impact statements from those whose lives had been devastated by Derek's crime. Robert Carpenter spoke first. At 84 years old, he moved slowly to the podium, but his voice was strong. "I was 62 when my daughter was murdered," he began. "I'm 84 now. I have spent 22 years not knowing who took her from us. 22 years watching the man who killed her raise his own children, build his business, live the life that should have been Melissa's." He gripped the podium for support. "My wife and I should be grandparents by now. We should be spoiling Melissa's children the way grandparents do. We should be watching her grow into middle age, celebrating her accomplishments, sharing her joys. Instead, we visit a cemetery. We talk to a headstone. We keep her memory alive because that's all we have left. Derek Hollis didn't just kill my daughter. He killed everything she would have become. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon, he stole all of it. I hope he thinks about that every day for the rest of his life. I hope he never has a moment's peace." Diane Carpenter followed, her statement shorter but no less powerful. "Melissa fought back," she said. "When that man attacked her, she scratched him. She struggled. She refused to go quietly. And it was that fight, those scratches, the DNA under her fingernails, that eventually brought him to justice. My daughter never stopped fighting, and neither did we." She turned to face Derek directly. "You thought you got away with it. You thought time would erase what you did. But Melissa's last act, her final fight, reached across 22 years to condemn you. She won. Remember that." Judge Liu addressed Derek Hollis directly before announcing the sentence. "Mr. Hollis, you have been found guilty of one of the most serious crimes our society recognizes. You took the life of a young woman who was loved by her family, valued by her community, and deserving of a future that you stole from her. For over 2 decades, you evaded justice. You lived among the people of this community, enjoying freedoms and privileges that you denied to Melissa Carpenter. You raised a family. You built a business. You presented yourself as an upstanding citizen while carrying a secret that would horrify anyone who knew it. The sentence I impose today reflects the gravity of your crime and the long delay in accountability." Derek Allen Hollis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Melissa Anne Carpenter, plus 25 years for the kidnapping charge, to be served consecutively. He would die behind bars. As deputies moved to escort Derek from the courtroom, he finally looked toward the gallery where the Carpenter family sat. For a moment, his eyes met Diane's. Then he looked away and was led through the door to begin a sentence that would last the rest of his life. The resolution of Melissa Carpenter's case sent ripples far beyond Snohomish County. It became a landmark example of how advances in forensic technology can breathe new life into investigations that once seemed hopeless, transforming cold cases into solved cases through persistence, innovation, and the preservation of evidence. Within months of Derek's conviction, the Washington state legislature approved funding for a statewide cold case initiative. The program would systematically review unsolved homicides and disappearances, prioritizing cases where biological evidence remained in storage and might benefit from modern testing methods. Detective Amanda Chan was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country, sharing the lessons learned from the Carpenter investigation. "This case taught us several things," she told a gathering of cold case investigators in Chicago. "First, preserve everything. Evidence that seems useless today may become crucial with tomorrow's technology. Second, document meticulously. The work done by investigators in 2002 laid the foundation for everything we accomplished in 2022. Third, never give up. Families deserve answers, and sometimes those answers take decades to find." The case also highlighted the importance of holdback evidence, information deliberately withheld from public reports that only the perpetrator would know. Derek's inadvertent revelation about the green sweater had been a turning point, providing corroboration that transformed circumstantial evidence into a compelling narrative of guilt. For the forensic science community, the case demonstrated the power of genetic genealogy and advanced DNA extraction techniques. The Virginia laboratory that had processed the evidence received hundreds of inquiries from law enforcement agencies seeking similar services for their own cold cases. The Carpenter family channeled their grief into advocacy. Robert and Diane established the Melissa Carpenter Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting cold case investigations and providing resources for families of unsolved homicide victims. The foundation funded DNA testing for cases where agencies lacked the budget and provided emotional support services for families navigating the long, uncertain journey toward justice. "We were lucky," Diane said at the foundation's launch event. "We had detectives who never gave up. We had technology that finally caught up to the evidence. We had 22 years of preserved samples that made identification possible. But not every family is so lucky. Evidence gets lost. Cases get forgotten. Families are left with nothing but questions. If our foundation can help even one family find the answers we found, Melissa's death will have meaning beyond the tragedy." The case also forced a broader conversation about the nature of evil and the capacity of ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. Derek Hollis hadn't been a serial killer or a career criminal. He hadn't shown obvious warning signs that would have alerted the people around him. He had been, by most measures, a functional and contributing member of society. And yet he had killed a young woman and hidden the truth for more than 2 decades. That reality was deeply unsettling for many people who had known Derek, who had worked with him, socialized with him, trusted him. "It makes you question everything," one former colleague admitted. "If Derek could hide something like that for 20 years, what else is hiding in plain sight? What do we really know about the people around us?" There were no easy answers to those questions. But the Carpenter case served as a reminder that appearances can deceive, that charm can mask darkness, and that the capacity for violence exists in unexpected places. The case also sparked renewed attention to other cold cases from the early 2000s, a period when DNA technology was advancing rapidly but hadn't yet reached its full potential. Agencies across Washington and beyond began reviewing their files, identifying cases where biological evidence might benefit from modern analysis. Within 2 years of Derek's conviction, 3 additional cold cases in the region were solved using similar methods. Families who had waited decades for answers finally received them, thanks in part to the precedent set by Melissa's case. The Carpenter family's journey had been long and painful, but in the end, they had achieved what so many families of unsolved homicide victims never do: certainty. They knew who had killed Melissa. They knew why. They had watched justice delivered in a courtroom, had heard the word guilty pronounced by a jury of Derek's peers. It didn't bring Melissa back. Nothing could do that. But it brought something that felt almost like peace. Melissa Anne Carpenter was 24 years old when her life was taken on a quiet stretch of Highway 9 in rural Washington. She was an administrative assistant who brought dedication and warmth to even the most mundane tasks. A daughter who called her parents to let them know she got home safe. A sister who kept her siblings connected. A friend who showed up when she was needed. A girlfriend who was cautiously optimistic about a new relationship. She loved plants and thrift store furniture and Sunday dinners with her family. She was training to run a half marathon. She had dreams she never got to pursue and a life she never got to live. For 22 years, her family waited for answers. They held vigils. They gave interviews. They established foundations and advocacy groups. They refused to let her memory fade or her case be forgotten. And finally, because of advances in technology, because of dedicated investigators who refused to give up, because of evidence preserved decades earlier by detectives who believed it would someday matter, justice was served. Derek Hollis will spend the rest of his life in prison. He will never again walk freely among the community he deceived for so long. He will never again coach Little League or attend church services or present himself as something he never was. The mask has been stripped away. The secret he carried for more than 2 decades has been exposed for the world to see. But Melissa is still gone. No verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can undo that fundamental loss. What her case teaches us is that the pursuit of truth is worth the effort. Even when the odds seem impossible, even when decades pass without progress, even when hope seems foolish. Cold cases are never truly closed. They are waiting for new evidence, new technology, new witnesses willing to come forward. Waiting for detectives like Amanda Chun who refuse to accept that some questions can never be answered. If you have information about an unsolved crime, no matter how old, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please report it. The detail you remember, the observation you dismissed as unimportant, might be exactly what investigators need. Every tip matters. Every piece of evidence counts. Every cold case solved brings closure to a family that has been waiting far too long. Melissa Carpenter's family waited 22 years. But they never gave up hope. They never stopped fighting for answers. And in the end, that persistence was rewarded. Melissa fought back on the day she died. She scratched her attacker, collected his DNA under her fingernails, left behind the evidence that would eventually identify him. Even in her final moments, she was fighting for justice. 22 years later, she won. And that's the message of her story. The message for families still waiting, for investigators still working, for communities still hoping. Justice may be delayed. It may take years or decades to arrive. But it doesn't forget. It doesn't give up. And neither should we. With that said, thanks for listening, and until next time.